Hey everyone, it's good to be with you again. We're going to continue in Psalm chapter 22. Last time we did verses 1 through 5. Now we're going to do verses 6 to 10. So we've already seen that David is in just anguish. I mean, he is screaming out to the Lord day and night, and the Lord just seems far from him. He's not answering him, and David's not accustomed to this because David and the Lord are pretty tight, right? And God just isn't reaching out to him. So in verse 6, David says, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who seek me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord," they say. "Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." See, David, he's just dealing with people who are mocking him for his faith. He says of himself that he's a worm. He feels like he's lower than human, and he's not a man. So this group of people here that's mocking him, it's interesting. They're not unlike Job's friends. If you remember the story of Job, where Job went through a lot of suffering as well. And his friends were like, "Man, Job, you must have done something to bring this on yourself. Like, there must be some sin in your life that is causing all of this suffering." Now, if you know the story of Job, you know that's not true. That's not what was going on, because Job was blameless before the Lord. Now, David's not necessarily blameless, but he is a man after God's own heart. He is wrapped up in the promise of God that was to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the nation of Israel. All of that. And David and God are tight. So these people here are saying, "Look, David, there must be something you're doing, some sort of sin in your life that's causing you anguish," right? And they're mocking him. They're like, "You know what, David? You know, if what everything you say is true, then just put your trust in the Lord, right? Just put your delight in Him, and then everything will be fine." Well, clearly, they're using this situation to kind of define God as like he's some genie in a bottle. Like if David would just do the right thing, then God would, magically be on his side and just do what David wants, right? But that's not how God works, is it? It's not. It's not how God works. It's not about our will. It's about God's will. At the end of the day, His will be done, whether we want what He wants or not. So, they're mocking him, and David then brings in a contrast. He says, "Yet you, Yahweh God, you brought me out of the womb," which, by the way, back then, it wasn't uncommon for children to die when being born. So even just to be born was seen as a blessing, because I think it was something like 50% or more of kids didn't make it. So, David says, "Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth, I was cast on you." I was cast on you as like David was basically laid prone before the Lord. Like, look, David is the Lord's, and the Lord will do with him what He wants. He will use David as His instrument. And he finishes up here. He says, "From my mother's womb, you have been my God." All the days of David's life, David has remained loyal to Yahweh God, and yet God seems far from him. So what do you do with that? What do you do? Well, one thing that I can tell you is that God does not break His promises. He is faithful. He is there, as we talked about last week, even though we might feel like he's not there, he is there, and he is acting out his purposes, his will. I was thinking about just suffering in general. A lot of us may feel like we're suffering and we're wondering, well, did this coronavirus come on the world because of, everybody's sins and that kind of thing? As if this is, one big judgment or whatever. And, I don't think so. I do think the world is the way it is because we live in a sin-saturated, fallen world. That's pretty clear in Genesis 1 through 11 and throughout the rest of the Bible. It's also pretty clear to me that as believers, we're going to suffer. I mean, it's a matter of fact. Just because we believe in Jesus, or if you believe in Jesus, that doesn't mean you're guaranteed a comfortable, cushy life. We're going to suffer. I was looking through some examples of suffering just in the New Testament, came up with 91 examples. We're not going to go through all of them, but I mean, look at this. Romans 5, verse 3, Paul says, "But we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope," right? But he's finding glory somehow in these sufferings because they all produce hope. They all produce this character in us, godly character that helps us get through stuff, right? He says, if we are children, then we are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings. Again, it's implied we're going to suffer. Romans 8, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." This life is but a vapor. James chapter 4. This side of eternity is a lot shorter than the other side. So that's the hope that we have in suffering, which I'm talking about during our sermon series. So suffering is a part of the Christian life. You can't separate it. Some people would say that, just like what David's people were saying to him, "Oh, well, you must be going through something because you don't have enough faith right now. If you just had enough faith and pray to God, then he would take it away. But if it's not being taken away, then apparently you don't have enough faith. There must be something wrong with you, as if it's your fault." But that's just not true. That's not true. The truth is, again, we live in a sin-saturated world. We're going to go through suffering. Suffering is a part of following Christ. We pick up our cross daily and follow him, right? But we have a hope in suffering, okay? Just like David had a promise that he was standing on with Yahweh God, we have a promise in Jesus. And Peter sums it up here. He says in verse 10 in chapter 5, he says, "And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." So look, we have the God of all grace. Grace, we talked about, is a gift. It's undeserved. We are humans. We are sinful. That's the way it is because of the fall. But God has an abundance of grace that he's willing to share with us if we just accept it. It's a gift. And he called us to his eternal glory. This is that eternal hope that we have with him, knowing Jesus is being with him for eternity. And we have that in Christ, who is Jesus. And he says, after you have suffered a little while. So our suffering here on earth is only temporary. Some obviously are worse than others, but at the end of the day, even the worst suffering is only temporary because, at some point, God himself will restore us, make us strong, firm, and steadfast because he's faithful. His word is faithful. His word is true. We can stand on it even in these times of suffering. So, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.